I don't know. They can cut out this first 2 minutes.
But I also like poetry.
Pretty sure.
Okay, thank you to everyone for coming. I want to welcome our attendees on Zoom also. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is the session on poetry of place and location. And what I had planned, the way I structured this, I want it to be more of a discussion about the topic, and hopefully you have some poems to share, some of us at least, we can give feedback on. And then we'll leave a few minutes for questions and reflections on the poems that were read or anything you'd like to discuss about the topic. First of all, is everyone here, most of you are from Wyoming, or are you coming from other states? I'm just kind of curious. Wyoming, okay, I think the majority.
I'm from Nebraska, but I've been living in Wyoming for about 14 years.
Oh, okay. Anybody from any faraway state, like California? Like Massachusetts, oh, East Coast person?
But not just for this, I live here.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's, a good way to enter this topic because we all have a very unique and distinct experience of place, which means we all have something to write about. I think that's the great gift of this topic in particular. Whenever I am kind of really lost and kind of searching for topics, I always go back to memory, either where I've been, something I observed, or where I'm at that moment. It's really about, I think, observing. Then bringing oneself in, and like some of the poems that are in the small packet that I Xeroxed for you, that are really also reflection about ideas that we have about the world or about the self, about one's biography. So I think this is something we can all do, and something that we all have in common then with the great modern poets, from many different countries, that they all write about the place that they come from and who they are as people. And then we get to see how, this is like the broader value of it. I think that the more unique, the more we are able to write about the very distinct place that we all come from, the more we see we have in common with people from very distinct cultures and very different places. And in the United States, we are in such a big country that we can almost speak about 50 different countries, really. Or even California. I'm a California boy, except when I've lived abroad a few years. But Central California, where I am from, is very different than where I live now in Los Angeles. Or Northern California, where I went to college and where I lived a few years. So I feel like I always have something to write about when I go back to this topic. I think other topics to write about in poetry, I think kind of are more based on just life experiences or difficulties that one has or something one is questioning. But this is really, I think, a very pleasurable place to go, of just being observant of where we're at and where we've been, and or the memories that we have of those places. So everyone does come from a very distinct place. In that sense, we are all equal. And we all have our personal histories, our own biographies that are unique. And that will make our poems, I think, original and unique. If we can be as specific as possible, about where we come from and the experiences that we've had in those places. You see that, for example, in James Wright's poem, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, which is in your packet. It's a shorter poem, which is just a reflection of a time of a year in Ohio, in a small town in Ohio. But it's deceptively a very simple poem, but if you think about it, it's very mysterious. There's all these things that are suggested toward the end, and we don't exactly know what they mean, at least I don't, but they're haunting. And yet we've all been, if you grew up in the suburbs like I did, to football games, and we all know these people to a certain extent. And yet he makes this very common experience very mysterious. Or Larry Levis' poem, which is a longer poem, where Family Romance is the title, where he is really gives us a short biography of himself as a poet from the Central Valley, from a farming community, and then ends with this very devastating reflection on his first marriage. So it's almost like a mini biography of the poet through the place that he came from in Central California, which is where I'm from. Now, there are poems also that are about places or locations that begin with a kind of scene, a description of a place, an observation, and then lead to a very surprising idea. Okay, so it's a very simple structure or conceit for a poem. Observe where you're at. If you look at Jose Emilio Pacheco's poem, The South Seas, he's just at the beach observing the turtles that are born and going to the sea to survive. Okay, and so we are led to believe, halfway through the poem, it changes. We're led to believe this is a nice poem about turtles and etc. But suddenly you see the birds, okay, what kind of birds they are, coming in, and they're eating the turtles, and they eat most of them. And at the end, in the one sentence, last line that ends the poem, he reflects on Darwinian natural selection, which we all accept in our culture, right? But he sees the birds coming in to eat all the beautiful little turtles as Nazi warplanes coming to. So it's very shocking and surprising that you begin with this beautiful poem about turtles, and then there's a twist that ends with this beautiful line that completely questions something that we accept in our culture, at least superficially, natural selection, survival of the fittest, etc., which does have a historical connection to eugenics and fascism and Nazism, etc. And Jose Emilio Pacheco was a great Mexican poet. He was an environmentalist also. And he wrote mostly about Mexico City because he lived in Mexico City. But since he was also an environmentalist, he wrote a lot about places of nature in Mexico. There are poems that are very autobiographical, that are deceptively autobiographical, like the poem by Cesar Vallejo, the great Peruvian poet, that the idea, the conceit in that poem is that he's reflecting how he will die, where he will die, and he, as a Peruvian poet, and 1930s Paris, he will die in Paris, and he did on a Thursday, actually. So he kind of predicted his own death. And he wasn't trying to. I think he was just really, as a poet, he was very imaginative, experimenting with language in Spanish. His, biographically in his autobiography, what he was doing is experimenting with language, and he was in Paris at the time, and so he was just writing about how he will die, so he wasn't trying to be prophetic, it just kind of happened, that he was just interested in the sound of the language in Spanish, me morí en París, and now. So it translates fairly well, but I will die in Paris, on Thursday, etc. But it's just a reflection, if it's a very simple idea, if you think about it. So there's nothing wrong with simple ideas. In fact, I totally believe in simple ideas. But if we are being very specific about what we are observing and what we are thinking about in the environment, those simple ideas will not be simple in the end, I think, if we're very honest and very specific. And I think that's what Cesar Vallejo did in a lot of his poems, and specifically in this poem. He's just thinking about where he will die, and he gives us a whole mini biography of himself in Paris, where he imagines he will die, and he did die in Paris. I'm just interested in what you think about this topic and how you are writing about it. Or how you want to write about it. But maybe we can begin with if anyone has any poems to share, and then maybe we can reflect more on this topic through their own poems. And if you could tell us where you're from, that would be helpful. Or at least where the poem that you write about takes place, because as we saw, we all come from different places, so we have different places to write from. So we're not limited, another way. I think that was my point, that this is not a topic that we have to study for or do our homework for, but that it's already in us. We all have a biography. We all have a very distinct biography of ourselves. And then we all have several places where we have lived or been to.
Do you just want me to read from here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm Nick Randall. I'm from Northeast Wyoming, but the poem I'm reading is A November Night in D.C. Alone under this streetlight, it's cold as I wait for a car in my tie and sport jacket outside a bar in Arlington. It's as cold as the Potomac, inky and heavy as it slithers. Its polluted coils through the swamp and toward the crab-haunted Chesapeake. It's as cold as the scarlet leaves shivering in the crowns of the trees that are scattered by some urban horticulturist that perhaps read a book about Johnny Appleseed when they were a child. It's as cold as the politicians scurrying from their big offices for an evening of fundraisers and extramarital affairs. It's as cold as the Gutenberg Bible behind glass in the silent darkness of the Library of Congress, godlike names gazing down from the vaulted ceiling, like Old Testament deities, swollen with outrage and displeasure. Dante, Herodotus, Poe, Whitman. Where to, asks my driver when he arrives. Anywhere, I want to tell him. Anywhere but where I'm heading.
Great. Yes. What was the title of the poem? Did it have a title?
On November 9, D.C.
Very descriptive title about where you're writing from. Again, it reminds me of James Wright's poem, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And, I see a lot of similarities between that poem and the James Wright poem, because it's about a place, but notice this is a great example of what I was mentioning. The fact that you're very honest and very specific about the place and your feelings about it, your own reflections on it, your own ideas about it, I think makes it, it's a very successful poetry a poem about a place, I noticed a lot of really good similes that were surprising and strange, like the politician's cold, there were several like that were really, just really fresh, in terms, just the similes, and almost like a list poem, like a Whitman kind of list poem, where you're reflecting in a lot of similes that are really surprising and make a lot of sense within the context of that place. And of course, it's a cold place. We get a sense of that. So yeah, we're off to a really good start there. There's exactly the kind of things I want us to think about. That not to overdo it with structure or philosophy or anything complicated, but just really reflecting on our own experiences of a place. And they don't have to be positive. Just because they're not like rosy doesn't mean that they're not valuable. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, and like James, right, it's a season as well as a place. They kind of go together.
Exactly. And because seasons in all places, of course, are very, and we all know this, I'm not telling you anything new, that they all are defined by, the culture is a lot defined by the seasons. Whether we're aware of it or not, in California we're not aware of it. We're clueless about that, but not in other parts of the country, I think, where life changes a lot and the reflections about life can change from season to season. Does somebody else have a poem they want to share? I don't know who had their hand. I think Echo did. Oh.
For me, that poem spoke of an emotional place.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
From the beginning to the end. He was in a cold place. He's in a
Mm-hmm.
season.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I noticed that too, and how it was very consistent in the way that it reflected on the season and the feeling of it. And Jose Emilio Pacheco's poem about the turtles, notice that it's not consistent because the image is of the beautiful turtles coming out to sea, and then it becomes very dark and menacing. All of a sudden, halfway through the poem, it becomes a kind of reflection on Nazi eugenics or something. And then it turns and kind of leaves you wondering, and then at the end, it just really floors you with this idea that makes you question something very, very difficult in a way. But through the turtles. But the turtles are obviously a metaphor for humanity. You can, there's no single way, obviously, to write about place, and you shouldn't stick to one anyway. But my suggestion is just to start very simple. Very often I do name them just the place where I'm at, and sometimes I do change them because I thought, something else. But, a poem called Los Angeles. Okay, that's fine. But then another poem that is about Los Angeles can be completely a different title and etc. So you can always play around with it, but start simple, I would say, just where you're at, and then you can always revise it. Do we have any more reflections on Nicholas' poem?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's a great irony in the middle of this poem. Cold is a place that you would assume people would want to leave from. But the cold is a metaphorical cold. It's a cold, at least that I interpret as misgiving, fear, anxiety. And he's saying that, take me away, but take me any place away from where I'm going.
Yeah.
Right, so that's where and I think I think I can tell when there's an honest poem, the sense of it, the idea behind it, that what happens a lot in, poetry that is about a place or location is that the ideas are kind of turn around, and there are a lot of ironies like that. Because we want to surprise, we want, for example, there are, I think start simple, but don't fall into stereotypes, it's like, oh, okay, LA is like superficial and dumb, or San Francisco's hippie or something like that. Obviously, we don't want to reproduce those, but I think when we have a real experience of a place, we will have ironies, we will have ideas that are strange, we will have ambiguities, we will have things that are mysterious, and that we can leave them that way, perhaps, if they sound good. And for that, I can't help, because if it sounds good, then just trust your instinct, because just because I don't understand James Wright's poem doesn't mean that it's not a great poem. It just means that it's really successful, because it leaves you very haunted. And you get a sense through the poem, however, in those places where it is very almost objective and concrete about Ohio, that you are in a very distinct place. But his ideas about the place, I don't know what they are, to be honest, but they are certainly good, because they still make me think about it every time I read the poem, or even when I'm not reading the poem, I think about this poem. I want to hear another poem.
This is also Ohio, June 1975. They rose, small lights from the lawn on evenings when we ran loose as coyotes until our mothers called us in. Lightning bugs, we called them. I ran barefoot through weedy lawn, catching them gently, one after another. Held them cupped in a carefully made cave of palms and fingers, seeing the glow against my skin. Their light shared, I released them unharmed into the humid night and continued the hunt. Once I saw lightning bugs in a jar, encased in glass, flickers doomed. Not my bugs, never mind. How much more joyous, their light shining brief, alive in the Cathedral of My Hands.
Wow, another very successful. You're making this easy. Again, I think that this a very good example really captures the place and the time, the 1970s. And Fireflies. I think I've only seen Fireflies once in my life as a little kid in Mexico. I've never seen them again. And I always remember them. It was at night and a certain time in Mexico when I was a child. But I have the image and the light, and I must have been 5 years old, as if it were yesterday. So I feel like I understood exactly the images you were creating with these fireflies and the lights, and I really love the end. I love poems that just end with a great metaphor. The cathedral. What was the last line?
How much more joyous, their light shining brief, alive in the Cathedral of My Hands.
Cathedral of My Hands. That's a great metaphor and a great way to end the poem, because a lot of it is very concrete and it ends with a nice surprise. Again, Jose Maria Pacheco's poems about the turtles. His ends with a statement that's very direct, like a declarative statement. Your poem ends with a very beautiful, mysterious kind of metaphor that creates a beautiful image that I think that's very hard to do, and it's very hard to end the poem with a surprising image that kind of reflects back on the rest of the poem in a nice, successful way. What did you all think?
I love that last line. I'm not sure where it came from. Like, I know there was a childhood game we played that had like the chapel and steeple. Oh yeah. But that's about the closest thing I could even think of. And you might not even been
thinking of that stuff.
And the fact that the light is in the middle of the cathedral figures is powerful.
I could feel that when you talked about the lightning bugs in your hands. I could feel it, and it's like that is so cool.
I really enjoy that it has this sense of rhythm, because when you began reading the poem, I thought what caught me was the line about the cave, palms and fingers, and so I'm thinking about, and I don't know, I just find that word very pretty, palms. So when we return to hands again, it's like a very pleasant surprise, but not it doesn't feel jarring, because there's like this image has sort of been, I think, like fed to us a little bit early, like kind of teased, and I think that's why for me at the end it lands so nicely.
Any other thoughts about this poem in particular? Now, the poem essentially is about observing the fireflies, the yeah, right. I think that's what it is. But it's very very specific and very concentrated poem, in the sense that it focuses on that, and the description of it, and the experience of, observing it, and at the end holding it in your hand, and etc. And it's also a memory. So I like those kinds of poems about place a lot. I write actually more about the past than I do the present. So when I write about a place, it's usually about a memory of a place. And sometimes it can be a very concentrated experience or an image that I remember observing, or it can be a memory about myself in a certain place, and it's more autobiographical, etc. This one seems to me to be very concentrated, very distinct in one place at a certain time in history, in a certain place in the United States, in a very specific experience at that time. Are the fireflies still there?
Sure they are. They were over there.
Okay.
When I was growing up.
Sure they are. They are. I was back there.
Were ya?
Yeah, not long ago.
You know, I've lived in Wyoming almost 30 years, and it's sort of like, but I keep getting drawn back to the place I grew up in terms of writing about it as place.
Yeah, and I mean, I asked that. I mean, I know it's nature, so it's very different than in a city. But I have a poem about Los Angeles in downtown Los Angeles in the 1990s, late 1990s, when I first moved there, before redevelopment and gentrification and all that. And so it seems historical now, because now it's a very distinct place, full of Starbucks and fancy places. Back then it was completely different. So I wrote it about that time, and it wasn't about a memory. But now it is a memory reading that poem now, because that place has completely transformed. I think with nature, we assume it doesn't change. But these days, I think we can't assume that anymore. Or maybe, and nature does change. I mean, things change in nature too, or the influx of people can change the natural environment also. And so that's what makes this topic, I think, to me, very not only interesting but also important, because we're part of history, but if we don't capture that history, it's going to be lost. Because the historians come in and they make things up, or they can, But poets, if they're honest, I can't say they're all honest, but I think we have a responsibility to be honest. And I think we are being honest when we're being imaginative and we're true to our own experiences and ideas about a place. Then you get the genuineness of a good poem, like the kind I gave you, I think. I'd like to hear another poem. Mm-hmm.
This is for me, I don't know. Sorry, my language. I'm from Ukraine. So I'm part of my father.
What is the title?
No, I'm from Ukraine originally. I live in Sundance, and I'm in the United States 7 years. Just married. So, and it's translation I wrote for Ukraine. More than 100 translation.
Let's speak loudly, please. Loud.
Loud, okay.
If you can.
Yes, I'm just my accent. I'm so sorry. So,
No, it's good. I can hear it.
It's my poem for my father. His passed 2016. I have 12 poems and read one today. Funny fisherman. My sweet dad wished a road and backpack. Walking along the striped patch. It runs to a secret place where there are a hedge, wild patch. He's letting lights go all over the place. Something pulls on the breeze. Oh, bumper about the weather. Snow falling everywhere. Heaven a blank ink. Oh, what my dear doesn't call. Otherwise have to run home, completely unpleasant. And the page don't want to bite. Daddy comes home without the valley and doesn't have a dam. So he's so light. He's got his health. He has restored himself. Sorry, my understandable. So he's go to fishing and he's catch walleye. Yeah. So he's not too much, and he's little regret, but happy for have something, and he'll healthy come back home. So.
Would you mind if I read it for you?
If you want, yes. Sorry, I just maybe more clear.
Before she starts, would you first read it in Ukrainian?
Yeah, I just don't have right now.
Oh,
original.
Where is it?
So,
Marjane.
It's called Funny Fisherman by Victoria Peterson. My sweet dad, with a rod and backpack, walking along the straight path. It runs to a secret place where there are a huge walleye perch. He is letting things go all over the place. Something pulls in the breeze. Oh, bummer about the weather. Snow falling everywhere. Heaven is black ink. Oh, that my dear doesn't call. Otherwise, I'll have to run home completely unpleasant. And the perch don't want to bite. Daddy comes home without the walleye and doesn't give a damn. His soul is light, he's got his health, he has restored himself.
You're all very good with ending. I think to end the poem is a very distinct talent. Not even great poets cannot always end a poem very well. All three poems end very nicely. I think what this poem is obviously about your father, but your father is a fisherman, right, in a particular place, and we get a sense of who this person was by the work that they do and the land that they're in and the And that's a very classical poetry of place poem. They can also be about people, and because, people are defined very often in poetry by where they're located and what kind of work they do and where they are, that was like a very, very touching poem. Do we have some feedback or reflections on the poem?
It has the mindset of a fisherman, like perfectly put down into words. I've never been much of a fisherwoman, but I have gone fishing, and that is what it really is. It's more restorative, and actually, it really doesn't come down to whether you catch the fish or not, especially for me. So I'm like, I don't want to eat it. I only like fish like a certain way, or some fish is too muddy. I don't know, I'm particular about fish sometimes. So.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate the contrast of it, that it's actually about two places, one of which is not necessarily revealed. It's about nature and fishing and the act of how he's rejuvenated at the creek or at the river, but also there's this unspoken, somewhat spoken unpleasantness at home that he's not looking forward to going back to necessarily, but that it's okay to go back because he's rejuvenated. So I like that there's two places in the poem.
Yeah, and this actually reminds me of, I don't know if it's a whole genre of poetry about fishing. And maybe fishermen also, but it seems to be that when, at least the poems that I'm thinking of about fishing are not really about people actually fishing. They're about some sort of metaphor of fishing, and I think this is refreshing because they are really about someone who does fish and the experience of it. But I think it was James Dickey who wrote a lot about fishing and rivers and stuff. And then there's the great poem by Elizabeth Bishop, The Fish. But that poem, it's really about the human condition. She's really just thinking about the cold. It's in Nova Scotia. And it becomes about, it's about the fisherman, but she's kind of distant from the fisherman, the poet. It's really about, the fishing is really about a metaphor for life. So this is kind of, I think, both. It's both about the experience of fishing and the person, So yeah, it can be, when we're writing about a place, obviously it can be biographical, it can be about ourselves, but it can be a reflection on somebody else and their place in that location, in that environment and nature and some sort of activity. It has to do with a very distinct place. I don't know if I don't think I give you any examples of that. But you can find, I think, a lot of examples of that. And American poetry, North American poetry, is very distinct in that. Because we are such a large country, and we have such a great poetry, very, very diverse poetry and very diverse kind of environments and people.
And I haven't studied a whole lot of it, but I think the same could be said about outgoing poetry. It's probably in a lot of ways very much about life as much as it is about, the cowboys' blades and their stories. Because a lot of it's about everyday life, but I think a lot of it could be metaphorical too.
Right, about life or some sort of, it's more philosophical, maybe about ideas, right? And not necessarily like riding a horse, right, or being a cowboy. Yeah.
There's an anthology of place that was edited by Maureen Flannery up at 10th Street, and if you can find it, it has all those aspects of
Oh.
place. Human beings as place, location, and experience in place, things like that. So if you're into place,
This topic.
it's a good guide.
Yeah, and I think I would advise to read, from poetry from other countries. There's a lot more being translated into English, and because a lot of American poetry is great. We have a lot, and there's anthologies, as you say. But when you start to read I'm thinking like I haven't read Ukrainian poets, but I have read the Russian poets, and and they're in Moscow or Leningrad, or was Leningrad, and it's a very distinct world. And the Neva River, and it's so gloomy and romantic and dark and very imaginative. And so to me, I'm very, personally attracted to that, because it is very un-American. It's a very different country, very different culture, very different history. I'm talking about modern Russian poetry, and Akhmatova and Marina Svatova and Mayakovsky and Mandelstam. They're all writing about the city, but they all do it very distinctly. And I like the gender differences. The men write very differently from the women. And in American poetry, you don't see that difference as much. I think in some of Elizabeth Bishop's poems, we would even not know if it was a woman or a man. That's great too. But once you begin to see those different, distinct particularities of different cultures and how they write about place, that will give you more ideas, I think, about how to write about your own place. I think at least it has me. Do we have somebody else who would like to share?
This one's very unpolished, and it's actually not about where I'm from, but I was reflecting a bit about kind of a nature memory for me. And I remember back in college, we took a trip to Seattle, Vancouver, and Victoria. And Victoria probably left the most impression on me, but also it was my first time I ever got to see any bit of the ocean in real life. So, the first time I saw the ocean. The first time I saw the ocean, it wasn't a sparkling, crystal clear blue, just the opposite. It was slightly gray with a mix of white and blue. The air held a cold mist. The gray sky seemed endless. It was a chilly March, yet it was breathtaking. I could not go touch the water, yet it had a special magic for this landlocked country girl who got to finally see something that seemed so out of reach a few days ago.
Interesting.
I like the sort of the contrast between how it was gray and the sky was gray, which sounds like awful, but it was magnificent.
Yeah.
And I love that sort of flip that, you saw the ocean on not one of its more pleasant moods, and still blown away.
Yeah. It is quite exciting to see. I've always loved bodies of water. I've always been drawn to it. I love to swim, but I haven't really swum in wild water too much. But yeah, for some reason, water has this kind of solace to me. I, in fact, love to write by the water. That's where I feel the most inspired sometimes.
Any other feedback or reflections on the poem?
Could I comment on Angel's poem? We have two things. One, let me take this off my head. We have one is what in your mind and in your imagination the ocean is.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the ocean. And it's a great thing about memory and anticipation and experience that we can be simultaneously enjoying what we thought we knew and learning about what we didn't know. And also remind you that Emily Dickinson wrote, "I never saw the ocean, I never saw the sea, but I know what a wave looks like and what a billow be."
Good point. And so we can have, see, our ideas don't need to be original, but our experiences are, because we're not in 19th century America. So the way that we're going to experience the ocean is very different than Emily Dickinson. And we will have, I think, a very different consciousness, a very different imagination than someone in the 19th century. So, any other thoughts about the poem? So I like the idea behind it because it's about not like seeing the ocean for the first time, right?
Well, I think that's what I did, but sometimes I think some of it eventually changes into different things. I'm kind of writing this during a time, and I'm still battling it a little bit, where I started learning I'm battling depression. And so some of that might have came off in my memory, where some of the depression struggle came in.
Yeah, and that's also very, something, poets are depressive. This is something that is also just part of poetry, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily is something debilitating. It's something that sometimes what is debilitating in real life, in art, is can be a challenge, but it's a way to overcome it or to do something with it, So that is also, I think, part of writing, I would say, and I think in the broader context, like nature, I think helps with that, with depression, with melancholy, with just being inspired, it's being closer to nature, I think is something very, very.
I always claim that writing is my therapy, although I can go to therapy now, but for the longest time I didn't like therapy, so writing was my main therapy for everything.
Yeah, and I think that's I believe that also. And that's one of the beauties of poetry. It can serve many different functions. Do we have another? These are all very distinct. Like no one is like repeating anything.
Were you asking for another poem?
Of another poem.
Okay. Vacancies for relief. Let there be trees, enormous trees on riverbanks that speak with white noise of insects and owls hurling their tenor at the moon floating out of a silo. Held high by willows building vacancies that rock the Orbweaver and her ball of children who will spill like good omen over uncircumcised hearts and skins of ripe pears in the paws of light. I twirl jasmine in my fingers, hold hummingbirds in my hands, undress your mantis body bound by human husk, while crayfish shift and find silt, and Ocelli blink this poem at you. And Ocelli is the eyes in a peacock's tail. It's the Italian word for it.
Do we have some feedback? Could you read it again? Do you mind?
Sure. Could you read it louder? I have a hard time hearing it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I was going to read Devil Sighting in Kidron, Ohio, but I left it in the car.
It would be helpful if you could read it toward us. June, I think.
Vacancies for belief. Let there be trees, enormous trees, on river banks that speak with white noise of insects and owls hurling their tenor at the moon floating out of a silo. Held high by willows, building vacancies that rock the Orbweaver and her ball of children, who will spill like good omen over uncircumcised hearts and the skin of ripe pears in the paws of light. I twirl jasmine in my fingers, hold hummingbirds in my hands, undress your mantis body bound by human husk, while crayfish shift in fine silt and ocelli blink this poem at you. It's an Ohio poem.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's an Ohio poem.
Yours. I just love the various specificity and detail in this, and the Orbweaver's got me.
They're so amazing. They really are beautiful.
Is that something different than a spider, or is that?
It's a type of spider. An Orbweaver is a type of spider, and it's a real common spider in Ohio, just like crayfish are.
Yeah.
It's like I used to have to go down and get the crayfish out of the stream and bring them back and cook them up for my brothers. And because we didn't have any money when we were growing up. So I had to cook them something.
Just a comment I have is just really great similes throughout that whole poem. There's just so many, and each one of them was just so unexpected but perfect when I heard it. Well done.
And I really never have held a hummingbird in my hand. I wouldn't do that to a poor hummingbird.
I was wondering if that was literal or not. So it's not.
It's not, but it's like that's why when you had the lightning bugs, the fireflies in your hands, it's like, yeah, that's cool.
I love hummingbirds, but I think I've seen one in my life, and I'm like, I'm gonna get some more feeders for them. Like, they really aren't that common here, and they're not common in Wyoming either, as far as I know.
Oh, they're yeah. You were gonna say something.
Well, if you do a series of poems, I would love the poem about you're getting the crawfish for your brother because they needed something to eat.
Oh, I have some poems about that too. Yeah.
And I get a sense that this is a poem that's working on different levels.
It is many.
Okay. And so in a sense, it's not what I was mentioning before of just observational and kind of keeping it simple and honest about what you observe or your memory of a place. Because there's a place here and the trees at the beginning that they're trees. I think it was very, very nice start. And then it takes us somewhere else. And is there something kind of sexy in there, or is that maybe I need to read it?
No, there is something kind of sexy in there.
Okay.
I've been accused of putting sex in a bunch of my poems.
Yeah, we like sex.
I do too.
There is absolutely nothing wrong with that, I must say.
Nothing sexier than entomology.
Undress your mantis body bound by human husk.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just feel like good omen. That's another one.
Yeah. But I like that it's suggestive instead of completely direct. And it functions well within the other layers that are in the poem of a place and the nature and the other things. Because there's a lot, I think, in this poem. It's not sticking to one idea, I think. like Cesar Vallejo's poem is like, where am I going to die? That's it. Of course, it becomes much more complicated once it starts. But I think this one starts one way and it goes somewhere else. There's some things going suggested and then it ends somewhere else. Right? I would have to read it much more carefully, I think, to be more specific.
It left me thinking with that eye thing that you told us about, that last line. Who's watching over it all? I don't know, that's just where it left me. When I got done and I started smiling.
I love that echo.
Any other reflections? I think we might have caught different aspects of the poem. It sounds like. Does anybody else have other thoughts?
I did want to mention the uncircumcised parts has nothing to do with, like, you know.
I was thinking about that too. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah, it meant, you know, a freer heart. You know, a heart that has been broken but overcome.
Well, I think we have just a few more minutes for questions that you may have, or perhaps what you will do with this topic, hopefully, or is there something you're thinking about writing, or?
What do you think about you have chance for after translation and publishing poetry? It's no sense. What do you think?
I'm not sure I got.
Lots of topics now in poetry. From my father, from Wyoming, I have 15, and I have from religion a little bit, you know, and mix from animals, you know. So just like comment, poetry, you know, comment, you're right, you know. So you have chance for a good edit and translation edit in my poetry for publishing. If it's not a good idea, just my question.
I mean, I think if you have a good translation of the poem, I think you could send it out and get it published. You know, yeah. I mean, I still do that. Send things out. Most of the times when I get something published, it's because I know somebody in a journal or something like that. That's just the honest way it happens. But sometimes you send it coldly to different journals, etc. If they like it, they will publish it, you know. But since you're translating it from Ukrainian to English, right?
Yes, I'm translation, and I have edit from New York editor. She's have no experience for like me, you know, for Russian, Ukraine, Slovenia, Poland people for writing. And she's edit from my poems. And no, this is only giving more, you know, more quality. Right now I have 50 poems.
Okay, that's
so like
might be a book.
5 different topics. Mix. So I'm thinking about what I need to do with my, you know, we need translate, need these people, not need people, you know, who like it. I don't want person for my book and laughing, what is this? Like, you know, just understand, yeah.
No, I mean, it sounds like you're on the right track. If you have somebody who's helping you translate and checking that. That's something.
Tell me about your editing technique. How do you edit your own work so that you have excluded unnecessary things, cliches, stuff that seems to be poetic that doesn't belong in the poem, all of that stuff? How do you go about it?
That's a very, very good question, because we all do that, actually, no matter at what level poetry you are, at stage, or etc. Okay, I think like I begin just myself, but the danger is that sometimes what we really like If somebody else reads it, they will point out it's not, I want to say faults, it sounds kind of negative. They point out things that actually don't work, but you were kind of attached to it and you thought it was great. And then somebody else, like I have a friend, a close friend, who's also a poet, and we share each other's work, especially when we're like a particular poem, we're not quite sure. So definitely other poets, I would say even more than editors, other poets, other friends who or actually not even poets, if they are friends who read and who are familiar with that, they can give you great editing advice. That has worked wonders for me. Because I'm not afraid to cut if it just doesn't work. You're supposed to cut anything that just is not needed in poetry, right? But sometimes we get too attached to it, and it's like, well, that's really cool, and it sounds great, or it's that. But then if somebody you trust tells you, that doesn't, yeah, that's really not working. And then you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, you're right. How come I didn't see it? Well, because I was attached to it. And so you just kind of let it go. It's part of the process, and it takes a long time, depending on the poem. Yeah, I assume this is like a lot of poets work that way. I'm assuming, but editing it's most of the work, you know. But it's also fun. It's like the part where you see you're kind of creating a little gem, I think. And if it's a good poem, you know it will become even better. So you're motivated, you know. But that's a good poem because we all need to do that. No, I don't know of any poets who write it and it's like ready to go.
In the movies.
In the movies, oh, okay. Because they're movies. It takes too long to develop that. I think there was a question up here in the...
I think I've always been into poetry ever since I started writing, but like just recently I've been pursuing it more than others, maybe because it actually doesn't get finished. But I noticed poetry has really helped me in editing and my other stuff because it taught me how to, leave out stuff that you don't need.
Anything you don't need, yeah. In fact, if it can be cut, cut it. That is the general kind of rule. It's very hard to do in practice. It's like, oh, that sounds so good. And then somebody points out, it's like, oh, you're right. Chop it. So it can be a little bit tough sometimes. Eugene?
Do you take, with writing a book as compared to poetry, I still set poetry aside for a while and go back to it, and maybe go back to it again. Because, like you say, it's kind of like looking at it for the first time. And then it's easier to pick out things that don't fit a bit.
When you leave it for a while, yeah. Yeah, definitely that helps, and it can be months later or a week later.
I guess that's what I was going to ask you basically, is how long would you do that for?
It depends on the poem. Yeah, there are poems that you write. There are poems that I've forgotten. There's some folder, and I come across them like, oh, why did I throw this away? Wow, this actually works. Let me revise that, and I salvaged it. And there are some that I was really attached to in, like the book I'm writing now, and suddenly I was like, you know what? I don't think that works. Or a poem that I had taken out of my last book, and then I sent it to a journal as part of a group of poems that I didn't think they would pick that one. That's the only one that they picked. And a friend of mine, a poet, who read it in the journal, I said, wow, that's a great poem. I was like, dude, you know what? I almost threw that one away. And you know what? You're right. I don't know why I didn't like it. It was about a cemetery in Modesto. Maybe I thought it was a little too gloomy or something, but it was a place, it was a poem place, but it's about the cemetery where my grandmother is buried, but it's not where my grandparents are buried, but they actually don't mention my grandparents. It's about the cemetery there, called Scenic Cemetery in Modesto. I had forgotten about that poem, but looking back on it, my friend was right. I was like, wow, this is a damn good poem. Why did I not like it? Poets are not always the best judges of their poetry, which is why we have to be very open and not take things personally. Either from our friends, well, you have to trust them, first of all. There are some writer friends that I have who are friends, but I don't have the same sensibility, the same taste in poetry or literature, so I would not give them just because they would not be helpful. And I have other poets who I much more connect with, and they will read my poem and always be right, or almost always give me good feedback. So I'm going to be talking a lot more about that stuff in my panel tomorrow on poetry and community, because I think that these are very... If somebody had told me when I was younger, I would have not wasted so much time on my own.
I have a similar story. In 15 years, I wrote poems, more than 100 words, and sneaky, because it's like my private. My friend, she's from Minneapolis. She's very speak English. She's from university. She's Ukraine, but she's very, very professional speak English. She's visiting, and she saw my journal, just like my notes. I forgot just put for my shelf. So you write poems? I said, yeah, I know it's Ukrainian. She said, I saw. It's Ukraine. I know, I understand. But you need to translate and do it for it. Why not? It's a nice one. This is okay, do this, So just friend.
Yeah.
So I'm very shy, just close, and nobody knows I do this. And just say, you need to do this. Because
Yeah, I agree. I think we're almost out of time, but thank you for coming. I hope this was helpful, and I would like to speak with you. Thank you. And I want to thank Echo and everybody else who's been and Derek, everybody who's helped me since I got here yesterday. And thank you for coming.
Okay. You know where that hotel is? That hotel name from San Francisco. It's down 10